I just wanted to, first of all, just say welcome to the Bay Area Book Festival's panel discussion called Claiming Space for the Self, Limitation and Liberation. And before we start, I'm just going to ask that people turn off the volumes of their cell phones. That would be great if you could do that. And my name is Natasha Singh, and I'll be your moderator for this panel. And before I interview our panelists, I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the Norway House Foundation and Norla, which is Norwegian Literature Abroad, for making this panel discussion possible. I also want to just let you know that books are available for purchase and signing, but there's a caveat. I think a lot of these books have been sold out. These two have been ridiculously popular at their other panels if you've seen them, and the word on the street is I think some of them are sold out. There might be some available, and you can also get a signed an autograph that will be on a sticker that you can get through Pegasus Books, which is selling books outside, and you can pre-order those books, get an autograph, and then those can be sent to you with no additional cost, and I highly recommend that. And I will tell you a little bit about my responses to their books shortly, but I can say that they're profoundly affecting. So I hope you go out and buy them afterwards. I'm just going to take a moment now to introduce our panelists. Jan Grue is the author of a wide-ranging body of work in fiction, nonfiction, children's books, and academic literature as well. And he's also a professor at the University of Oslo. His book, I Live a Life Like Yours, was published in 2018 in Norway, where it won the Norwegian Critics' Prize for Literature and was nominated for the Nordic Council Literature Prize. And it was also the first Norwegian nonfiction book to be so honored in 50 years. So welcome, Jan. And Chloé Cooper Jones is a philosophy professor and freelance journalist who was a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize in feature writing. Her work has appeared in publications including GQ, The Verge, Vice, Book Forum, New York Magazine, and The Believer, and has been selected for both the Best American Travel Writing and the Best American Sports Writing, and she lives in Brooklyn. Welcome to both of you. Just a quick question. Have any of you seen any of the other panels on which either of these two are on? Okay, well, you're in for a treat. Okay, I'm going to start with a question for the two of you. And I'm just going to pull some quotations from your books. Jan, you wrote, and before I even read this quotation, I'll tell you I'm really interested in this idea because both of you explore it so much in your books, this idea of navigating this external gaze and being very present to it. And Jan, you write, to be stared at, gawked at, is to develop an external sense of oneself, a sense that is always pre-modulated to the expectations of the surroundings. It is also to be situated in a narrative that has already been written and that is told by others, end quote. And Chloé, your book begins with you noting how that man at the museum needs not only to talk to you, but also to explain you, categorize you, label you. He wants, you write, quote, an uncertain thing to yield to a category assigned by his reason, end quote. And I'm wondering if both of you can talk about that tension of being situated seemingly relentlessly in somebody else's story and what it has meant and perhaps even required of each of you to write your own.
You want to go first?
Well, it's a really beautiful question, and I'm so glad that you read that little bit from Jan's book. I got chills just sort of encountering that language again. I just want to say, I think that the experience that you're talking about is all of our experience. We necessarily live in a world of strangers. And so our mind, in order to cope with that, like actually truly terrifying reality, right? That like if you really, we shouldn't spend any time thinking about this, but like if you really think about it, we're just constantly moving around in a world of completely unknowable minds. So our brains have coping mechanisms for that. And one of those coping mechanisms is to identify typically a visual fact about you, identify it really quickly, and then move the narratives that you've learned about that identifiable fact or visual fact quickly to front of mind, and then never think about you again, right? Have that first thought about you and then never think about you again, or have a second or a third thought about you. So the thing about that is that if somebody's first thought, or if the narratives that someone's lived under is their first thought is like pity or concern or lack of belief in your ability, which has been my experience as a disabled woman, and maybe specifically as a small disabled woman, and maybe even more specifically as a small disabled woman who moves with a sort of labored side-to-side gait. So people obviously isolate that visual thing very quickly, and the narrative they assign to that is inability, pity, precariousness, lack of strength, and that's what I see reflected back to me everywhere I go. It's every moment of being in a grocery store, or I live in New York, so on the subway, and it is impossible not to a certain extent, internalize that narrative. And so in order to write about it, one must sort of try really hard to look at the ways in which they've internalized it and see, if it's possible to examine that. But not only to examine that, but for me to examine the ways that I've been complicit in really like reifying or codifying that gaze myself in my own self-protective or defensive actions. But I don't think that's particular to disability. I think that experience that I'm talking about is our shared human experience. And my sincere hope is that in my book, and I think in Jan's too, that we're opening up a discussion that maybe is specified through our own experiences in our bodies, but is extraordinarily relevant to anyone in a body.
Yeah, no, I really identify with a lot of what you just said, Chloe. I mean, it's interesting for me to be here in the US now with a book that came out first originally 4 years ago. So I've had time to sort of to see it be in the world for a while, and of course that forces me to think about what I was trying to do with the book, what I maybe failed at doing with the book, and what kind of an ongoing project we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. I think what you said about internalizing and dealing with these categories, and also recognizing what you have been doing yourself is really important here. I think the word disability is key, and also just a huge set of problems as soon as you start looking closely at it. I didn't use the word disability in my book. I used it once when I talk about what I do at work in academia. I tried to describe myself and my experience of the world without using that one label that had been applied to me all of my life. And that felt like an act of resistance at the time of writing. And then, of course, time passed, and I realized that there were also a number of problems that came along with that elision of the word, with avoiding that particular label, because of that means that I also missed the chance to talk about community, to miss the chance to talk about politics, really. And that was necessary at the time, I think, in order to be able to write about my own experience of the world and those that part of my own experience that felt like it was something else, something, I don't know, something that was safe from those categories projected onto me. Yeah. I had to do that, but I ended up actually writing a counter book, which came out in Norway last fall, which was about exactly the thing I was trying to avoid in the first one. And so there is this sort of need, I think, to both recognize how those categories are internalized, and then to look at sort of different strategies that can be drawn on for resistance, but it's an incredibly difficult process in many ways. And also, no, I think the final thing is that yes, it's not specific to disability, but it's also very specific to disability in particular ways.
Yeah.
There is the sort of the unique element to that, which is also related to many other human experiences and minority experiences. And just trying to parse that is what makes it so challenging and interesting to write about.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just say?
Yeah,
Can I
please,
just
go ahead.
respond? Yeah, I mean, I spent my life really trying to avoid that word disability because, just as you're saying, it's already what people are putting on me. And it's already this thing that I'm trying to help people see beyond. And I had this idea for a long time, and this is not a good concept, but it was based in reality, that in order for people to see like the real me, they had to first unsee my body. And that there was some like real me that was inside my body, and as soon as people like forgot about all this, then they could then I could have a real conversation with them. And of course, what that meant was then I never talked about disability, and I didn't write about it. I didn't study it. I didn't learn about the history of the ADA and people who had fought for the rights that I enjoy now in the States. I just really tried to act as if these two things were separate. And it was largely because of this sort of what seemed in some ways and is like an act of resistance, but also, and I think this is so important what you just said, like is a missed opportunity to think about community as well. And there's a scene in my book in which I'm kind of doing all these things, like I go and I try to be a sports journalist for a while, and then I'm like writing about movies, and I'm trying all these different sort of things. And a friend of mine is sitting at a bar and he says, why do you always want to be a novice? Like, why do you always want to be on the outside of everything? And I say, because as soon as you give yourself a label, as soon as you acquire a title, there's so many people who will treat you as if that's all you are. And here we are on Mother's Day, and I'm a mother, and that happened to me when I became a mother. It was like, there were so many people in my life who were like, oh, okay, goodbye, you're not coming to the bar ever again, right? Or when I became a wife, or even when I got my full-time professorship, all these really wonderful things could add to this feeling of being like filed away by other people's definitions of that label. And that is a really reductive and dehumanizing thing, but on the other side, it's also membership in a community is really important, and that tension for me was so hard to figure out. So I'm really curious, like what this process, and you're talking about writing this other book that's, sort of countering this, like how did you actually figure out how to reconcile these tensions? And I don't mean to do your job. I'm just really curious.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Listen, I think the most exciting thing, I'm sure, for everyone, and myself included, is conversation. So absolutely, go ahead and ask your question.
I mean, that's really a hard thing, I think,
Yeah.
for everybody, but like, yeah, what was that process like?
What's the Beckett line? Fail again, fail better. I think it had something of that to it. One concept that became very important for me, and I hesitate to talk about this with a trained philosopher, but Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblances turned out to be very important to me. So Wittgenstein talks about games, I think is his original example, that there's no one thing that every game has in common. I mean, board games, sports games, there's no one thing that all members of this category share, and yet there are family resemblances. So some things share some qualities. You could say the same thing about birds. Not all birds can fly, not all birds share the same characteristic, and yet there are family resemblances. I really think that applies to disability. I mean, in reading your book, as in reading a lot of what I hesitate to term disability memoirs, but nevertheless, there is a family resemblance. There's no one thing that every disabled person has in common, but there are moments of recognition, there are moments of solidarity, perhaps. I loved many things about your book, but your scene of the scene in which you encounter Peter Dinklage And for a moment, you're the only two people in the room, or at least you're the only two people in the room who share a particular social experience, which, of course, you recognize that you may or may not be projecting onto him, because, of course, he is unknowable, as all celebrities are. But there is nevertheless this sense that there is solidarity, perhaps. And that became increasingly important to me in this writing, in trying to recognize the things in myself that I tried to keep suppressed by avoiding the disability label, the disability concept, and then trying to explore the reasons behind that. I'll throw in one more philosophical concept and then I'll let it go, from the work of Julia Kristeva, the concept of abjection, the abject, of the thing that we shy away from in horror, particularly in other people, disease, illness, anything that reminds us of our own deaths, really. And that is really key in creating the kind of response to disability that so many of us have experienced. And then, allowing for the fact that I have these responses myself. I mean, as a physically disabled person, I grew up with this really sense of abjection when encountering people with intellectual disabilities, because hey, at least I'm not one of them, right? And sort of trying to deal with that was the driving force in this other book.
So I wanted to pick up on several things, which I hopefully will get to. When reading both of your books, I went through a little bit of a personal kind of a dilemma in a sense, because at first your books are very different. They're very, very different, and yet I found myself feeling profoundly anchored in my body. And I know when you first started your remarks and you talked about the ways in which this book can apply to any body, I found myself reflecting on things that I had not thought about in years in terms of stigma and skin. And I also was really struck by the ways in which you laid bare your defenses against the scrutiny in a way that was extremely candid and remarkably so, I would say. I also noted your use of the term disability and your seeming ambivalence towards incorporating or using that term, and I noticed its absence from your text. I also noticed points of overlap in things that you did address as writers, and one of those overlaps included this wrestling with categories and being categorized. And just to give the audience a glimmer into what you were talking about on page 52 of your book, you describing when you were talking about a conversation with Jan, I think you just referenced it now, you shared your ambivalence towards claiming disability as a subject of study, and you told him, quote, "There's no line between exploring and exploiting. As soon as you identify as something, people start telling you who you are and what you mean. They put you in a little box and leave you there. The second you say you belong to a community, you speak these imposed limitations into existence." And then later, you write in your own sort of self-reflective journey, you note, "My thinking was locked in a false dichotomy. I thought I was either limited by a definition or left lonely outside of one. But I'd not left room for this third possibility, which found its way to me in Peter Dinklage's handshake." And I think to me what really struck me as an interesting convergence in your texts was this interest in liminality and liminal space, the unknown, this third space. And I'm wondering if you both could talk about that space and what that means.
Sure. Should I? Yeah. Well, I think it's very hard to talk about this without talking about diagnosis, because I think that probably every person deemed disabled who identifies as disabled has either has a diagnosis or has been assigned one or has tried to acquire one. There are many permutations of this, but it means that you have a very intimate and embodied relationship with something that is, a fact of medical taxonomies, which becomes life-defining. I talk about this in the book, with the way that diagnosis is tied up with prognosis, and so it really, in many ways, it maps out your expected life trajectory. There are variations of this. There are racist taxonomies that have profoundly influenced the world. And so, of course, that's something that generates resistance. I mean, it's something you rub up against every day. And so I think the sort of the impetus towards liminality is quite logical, would be sort of the brief answer to that. There is, I mean, diagnostic categories are almost by definition imprecise. I mean, there are spectrums, there are shifts, they evolve over time. There are so many more diagnoses than there used to be because we have genetic sequencing, which we didn't a mere 2 decades ago. And yet those systems are treated as ahistoric and immutable by quite a lot of medical practitioners for one. So that's just a sort of a fact of the social world that creates its own response, and I think which was, in its time, one of the reasons why we got the disability movement in the first place, as a counter force to medical power.
Well, that's such a beautiful question. I'm really, I'm so grateful for it. Can we do all of our events together? Or this is so, I feel very seen and also challenged at the same time, which, what a gift, what a gift. So I just want to go back to something you were saying at the very beginning of your question, which is, and I'm really grateful for this, that you said that reading these books put you in a sensation of your own body, or had you think about certain things. And I've had a lot of readers who've come up to me and have said things like, or sent me messages and gone, hey, I don't mean to like compare my situation to yours, but, and I always like the sentences that start that way, because I actually really, I love the ways in which our experiences of life and our bodies might overlap, or might find, if we think of liminal as a word that is thinking about the space between boundaries and the space where boundaries can touch or come into contact with each other. Like, I love that. I really want that. I don't think it's the same as conflating, right? We don't want to conflate our experiences. And my hope is that people will have enough curiosity about disability and will educate themselves about disability enough that we can talk about our experiences without conflating them, and vice versa. And so that's a really important sort of like looking at those spaces where we overlap. And disability is so interesting, and this sort of maybe touches on what Jan was just saying, is that that term disability is a gigantic umbrella that incorporates so much. And I think that there's some thinking sometimes that because that term encompasses so many different lived experiences, that's in part, and I'm not saying this is the right thought, I'm just saying this is a thought, that's in part why disability as a movement is so far behind, especially in the United States, other movements, right? Is that maybe we have these family resemblances in our experiences, but our experiences are not the same, or we're not experiencing the same types of pain or prejudice or needs. Our relationship to healthcare is different, our relationship to our body or prognosis. Like, it's so diverse that sometimes that makes it harder for people to come together theoretically and have a unified movement that might put disability issues or things that are valuable to a community to the forefront, unlike other types of, marginalized communities that have maybe had more success in that way. I still think disability is one of the least understood and worst represented experiences at all. I mean, when I look at film or television or literature and I see a disabled body, I think, okay, oh no. This person is going to have no agency. I mean, if it's a character written by somebody else, no agency. desexualized and probably die at the end, and their death will be very valuable for all the able-bodied people to recognize how valuable their real lives are. And, spoiler, we don't die in our books, like we live. Yeah, thank you, yes. I have sex too, it's great. So, yeah, I mean, those like narratives are really important, and it's like, well, why are they so poorly represented? Is it because our experience is so disparate we can't band together and organize in the way that other communities have? And again, I don't think that's the right answer, but I think it's something people think. And I guess part of what I would like to think more about or talk more about or write more about is that like every single one of us is on a spectrum of disability. And if you live long enough, if you're lucky enough to live long enough, you are going to have a lot of experiences about, the changing capabilities of your body. People become disabled in an instant. People get sick and ill, and they get better and they get worse. So what I really hope, in part, is that talking about disability or writing about disability isn't an experience where I'm educating people about a foreign land that they're like, I guess I should just learn about this thing, be woke or whatever. No, but it's like, how is that going to help you reconceptualize your own relationship to your body and your abilities and the trajectory that we're all on with our bodies? So that, again, is not meant to conflate or reduce the sort of singular or unique things that the disability community faces, but rather is a opportunity or an invitation for you to think about your own bodies in relation to that, which I'm sure many of you already do, but I don't see as much. With that abjection, it's like, when I see that in the eyes of others, I want to be like, this could be you. Like, what? You should get comfortable with this. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm just going back to what Jan, you said earlier about diagnosis, and I was really struck by the ways in which you took that word and turned it over in your book. And you talked about it not literally as being handed a fate, but pretty close to it, where someone draws a conclusion, or as you said, it's a prognosis. And then you had that experience as well of being told that diagnosis was incorrect, and that opened up something as well. And you also write a lot about the papers in your text, and you reference them, and they're the papers from medical doctors and social services and so on, and you describe the clinical language that was used to describe or write your body as well as your future. And you wrote in your book that you wanted not only to find another language, but also to know your body in another language. And I'm curious if you can talk about that, and I have a question for you too as well about language, but I'd love to hear from you first.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that made it possible for me to write the book in the first place, was to have a good enemy. That's important in writing. I think I started work on the book without knowing it, probably a decade before it became published. But I had biographical sketches. I had some more academic pieces, but the transformative event was being given those papers, and I write about it in the book, that they were given to me by my parents after I'd become a father. Now my parents felt that, okay, we can pass this burdensome archive on. And so just reading this particular narrative about my own life gave me something to go up against. And I've seen other people do the same thing. I mean, I've worked for a while in medical sociology, with looking at the ways people who had been diagnosed with myalgic encephalopathy, chronic fatigue syndrome, how they dealt with their situation. And one pretty common strategy was to try and write about it. They are by far the most active community online of any diagnostic group, and probably one of the reasons why that is the case is that they do not see themselves as being fairly represented in medical language at all. So you've got blogs, you've got narratives, you've got various kinds of attempts to, through the mastery of language, take charge of their own stories. So I think that's an important part. I noticed also in your book, Chloé, the way that you engage with the philosophical canon, fighting with it, arguing with it, subverting it, and doing so, of course, in a book that is profoundly narrative oriented. It's just one of the ways of dealing with something that you do not agree with, but also refusing to play on the terms presented by that language. It's this sort of verbal jiu-jitsu, which works really well in your book, and I think it is one of the best strategies available.
Thank you.
I do want to ask you just about the use or incorporation of various philosophies, but I want to also ask something first. And this is also reference to language, where this is in your book you'd written about having a conversation with Colin in the bar, and you reflected, quote, "I lack the language to explain my relationship to disability. I never talked about it. I didn't write about it, acknowledge it, study it. I hid it in photographs. I'd spent my life waiting for people to reach their place of comfort with my disability so that they'd forget about it, and then I could be seen. Of course, I'd succeeded in erasing a part of myself," end quote. And when I read that, I was struck by you not only having to navigate categorizations and ways in which disability or being a member of that community, whatever that means, you not only had to navigate that, but then this idea of coming up with a language of your own to explain your relationship to disability is quite something. It's different than having a language to name your. It struck me that you're having to make up something, that it wasn't there for you, and you're talking not about disability but your relationship to it, which seemed to me both connected and also separate from one another. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that, what it meant to find and what it means, even now sitting in this seat, to have your own language to describe this relationship.
Yeah, well, first I just hope, Jan, that when my paperback comes out, that I can count on you for a blurb that says the verbal jujitsu, or
For sure.
wait,
For sure.
because that's great. Yeah, put it on my tombstone too. It's a great compliment, thank you, and very meaningful, because it's certainly something I worked really hard and thought a lot about. I mean, language is, in the form that I'm talking about it strictly in this moment, is specifically about how one mind communicates to another, right? Through some sort of lexicon. And so if we think about language in that specific term, or in that specific way, that I need to make meaning with units of speech, then I didn't have that language to defend. And I should just say, I can't remember if you just said this, but this is an important bit of context. This man, Colin, I'm having a drink with him at a bar, and he makes an argument that my life was not worth living, that my disability, any disability, renders life so inherently inferior that it should not happen. And he actually makes this argument that is well rehearsed in philosophy. He didn't come up with this argument, that disability is so permeates a life so completely and negatively that people with disabilities shouldn't be seen fully as persons, shouldn't have the same autonomous rights as persons, and that we shouldn't think about aborting them the same way we would think about aborting a non-disabled. So he makes this argument to me. And I think what's really important is that's not the first time I've heard that argument. In fact, it's an argument I hear over and over and over and over and over in different ways, either explicitly, like Colin in the bar, or in movies where people are like, let's kill this disabled person so that other people can live. So like that is a rhetoric I hear all the time. But if I don't have a critical consciousness about it, right? Like if my orientation toward that prejudice or belief or set of ideas about my body is, if my orientation toward that is to ignore it or to insulate myself from it, to hide from it, in order to not feel the pain of it, then I can't really engage with it. I can't really talk about it. I can say why my Chloé Cooper Jones, like why my life seems worth living to me, but that's not what he was talking about, really, this guy at the bar. He wasn't talking about, like, Chloe, you suck, you shouldn't be alive. He was saying something larger, and it's a social belief, a cultural belief, a narrative belief. And if I've never studied that, and if I've never thought about it, and if I've never put myself in a conversation with that community who bears those stigmas, if I've instead preferred to pretend, to lean heavily into cognitive dissonance and pretend that I am not in a disabled body, then I can't functionally engage. I don't have a language, capital L language, to even defend against this man that my life is worth living. So in order to really do that project, I had to think very seriously about how I'm seen in the world. And that meant really letting all that painful stuff in, letting all those stigmas in, and trying to be genuinely reflective about it. But then, as I said before, to be much more critically reflective about the ways in which I perpetuate those bad ideas. So, or are complicit in those bad ideas about disability. And one of the primary ways that I did this, was complicit, is that I would just hide in a like abstracted mental space. And in the book I call it the neutral room. So when people were unkind, or I was in pain, which is all the time, or I had to face something uncomfortable, I would just sort of dissociate and be in an abstracted mental space in order to not really situate myself critically in what was happening. And let me tell you, and I'm curious how your experience of this is too. So this is my first book, and I've been on book tour this month. And what that has meant is that I have to put my body on display and like be in public like this on a stage. And that is an inherently uncomfortable thing for me to do. And it's also important for me to think about what it means for like my body to be seen and to be talking about all of that with you. And there's a very heavy thing in my mind that wants to just like, instead of like looking at you, like kind of talk to the ceiling, you know, like dissociate from this experience. Also because did you know that like public speaking is the number one fear that people have? Mm-hmm. Like they did a study, it's like, they're like, what's the absolute worst thing that can happen? They're like speaking in public, and then death is 2? Like, that's wild. So like everything about this moment with all of you and this whole tour that I've been on is like a deeply, deeply painful and uncomfortable, and painful on all the levels. Physically taxing, mentally taxing, emotionally taxing, embarrassing, like everything. And everything in me right now wants to dissociate. But instead, I'm really trying to think about, you know, to be more critical and thoughtful. What does it mean to put my body in space? What does it mean to ask people to look at my body and see me through a lens of respect or interest rather than pity? And to really think critically about that allows me to form this language. So the book finds me without that. And a lot of the book is me trying to seek that language. And I seek it through reading people's work who bear me a family resemblance, by joining a community, but also by really looking at my own life and the experiences that I've had that have shaped this lack of this language. And it's one that I'm still acquiring, and I think is a lifelong project.
Mm. Yeah. I think I have a couple of things I really wanted to say there, because it's well, okay, let's start with the philosophers in your book, because they are they're quite a bunch, and you do a really good job of showing, you know, what parts of philosophy have become sort of this trying to have a very principled, objective discussion about who should live and who should die, which is an interesting place for a discipline to have gone. But of course, the best way to show the grotesqueness of that is just to, you know, have them speak their minds. In a very non-neutral space, even though they, well, Colin, right? I mean, who seems to think that he's taking the view from nowhere and being very objective about it all, but you know, it's one guy with some pretty horrible opinions that are nevertheless very deeply anchored in an academic discipline. I'm writing a novel these days, and I try to do pretty much this part of the same thing that you were doing there, but I'm playing the scene much more for comedic effect. So after making similar arguments, the philosopher character literally trips over a baby. I figured that's the best way to sort of bring real life into the scene. They're having a discussion about prenatal diagnostics and why everyone should be tested for everything, and abortions should be predetermined by diagnostic results. And then on the way to the bar, he trips over a baby. I think that's just my way of saying that I absolutely agree that it's a lifelong project, and it's also a project of staying close to life as it is embodied. I think there are some of these arguments that can't really be met in that abstracted space, because it's not a fair fight. There's of course this canonical piece in disability studies where the lawyer and activist Harriet Mcbride Johnson went to see the philosopher Peter Singer and wrote about her experience arguing with him in what was precisely the right way to deal with his utilitarian view from nowhere, by simply describing what their encounter was like, and how their arguments were inevitably embedded in their actual experience of the world. And I think that's one of the trajectories along which this kind of writing that we're both dealing with can make its most significant contribution, and maybe garner the kind of reader responses of re-remembering your own body simply by staying very, very close to embodied experience in that way.
I think you both do this is also something you share, I think, in your work, in that there's the ability to be very abstract or philosophical, but I think you acknowledge the limits of, or I think there was a time where you were talking about using one of Plato's, do you know which one I'm talking about? One of Plato's, I have it written here. This is where there's a part in the book where you talk about how Plato separated people into classes, and the highest of which are the philosophers whose obsession with futile work of narrowing the separation between truth experience and truth made them noble. And then you just talked about how you could use that lens to recast yourself as noble and even as up here, or somehow distant or separate from people, or maybe, I don't know if you use the word superior, or you may have, or judgmental, or what have you. And I was really in awe of that, because I feel like, again, going back to what I'd said earlier, you really laid bare the ways, you clearly love philosophy, but you also laid bare the ways in which you could use it as a weapon or a shield. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that too, just in terms of, and maybe what I'll add to that really quickly is you do that, and yet I think what you both share in your books is an appreciation of embodiment and simplicity and connection and communion, whether that's, Jan, with your family, and you really claiming that at the end. Your last lines end on these very ordinary activities, but there is such a beauty in that, and I think that's such a remarkable thing, to go from these great heights in your books, abstract thinking, philosophy, all kinds of references, and then you just really ground the narrative in the body and in the ordinary, and somehow manage to make it all extraordinary at the same time. I mean, it's really something. I'm wondering if you have any comments about that.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what I've talked about is sort of the ways in which in the book is trying to excavate, is the ways in which my defense mechanisms or coping mechanisms kept me apart from other people. So quite often, I think this is true of many disability experiences, but certainly mine, is this thought that you have to overcompensate for what people see as, your inferior life or whatever. So I was not, as a woman, given, my body was not the thing that would get me any value in the eyes of other people, but my brain could. So I was like, okay, I will just be smarter than everybody else. So I got 2 PhDs, which nobody needs, by the way. it's completely pointless to do that. But I was like, I'll get one more than everybody else. And then I was like, I've got to get the Pulitzer, and then I have to get this, and I have to. And there was this thing that was driving, I think, my work, which was not about the work itself, which is a bad place to do work from, but was about building a scaffolding of protection around myself. And philosophy is a wonderful tool for this. I'm a huge believer in philosophy and lover of philosophy, but there's a lot in philosophy that you can use to build a scaffolding of superiority or protection around yourself if you choose to use it badly that way, which I did. Because then it was like, okay, if the world's going to keep me separate from them, if they're going to put me to the side, then let me look at them from above. That's sort of the line. So this is, I think, a good way of making that sort of abstract thing I just said more concrete is to talk about just the title of the book. So the title of the book, Easy Beauty, comes from this philosopher Bernard Bosanquet, who differentiates between two different types of beauty. One is easy beauty and the other is difficult beauty. Now, to be clear, when he writes about these two ideas, he doesn't express that one is better than the other, okay? That's a mistake I'm gonna make. Easy beauty, he says, is just simply the kind of beauty that arrives very immediately to our minds, to our eyes, to our senses. He gives the example of a rose or a sunset or a simple spatial rhythm. We hear a song, immediately feel something, and this form of beauty is, are you just sure? Okay, sorry, I'll go fast. And difficult beauty, he says, is just simply beauty that requires more time and more patience, more effort, sometimes more education to really appreciate. Difficult beauty, he says, is, and maybe you've all had this experience, I certainly have, like looking at a particularly complex painting or hearing a really difficult piece of music and having an experience that it is resistant or opaque to me for a moment. And then maybe a great teacher kind of explains something to me about it, or maybe I take the time and I'm patient and I look at it for longer, or maybe I learn more about it, and then something kind of magical happens. And in fact, this is maybe my favorite thing in the world, is that my perception of that object literally changes, right? So at point A, I can't see its beauty, and at point B, after I've given myself time or knowledge, I suddenly can. And that is like an astounding experience for me, and it makes my mind feel so powerful. And that is what Bernard Bosanquet is kind of talking about, is difficult beauty. The problem is that we don't always give difficult objects of beauty our time, our patience, our empathy, our awareness, and instead reject them outright as ugly. And just to do a full circle to Harriet Mcbride Johnson, who Jan was just referencing, a disabled activist and writer, she has this line in the New York Times Magazine piece about, in her conversations with Peter Singer, where she says, "I'm not ugly, you're just not looking at me right." And I'm probably butchered that a little bit, but it's basically that. She's like, "I'm great, you're just not paying the right kind of attention." And that line like cuts so deeply into me, because I think I misuse this idea of difficult beauty as a protective force. I say, I don't have a body that's easily going to be slotted into an immediate experience of beauty. So then I go, well, okay, I'm not ugly. You're not very smart. That's it. That must be it. You're just not thinking. You're not educated enough. You're not spending enough time with me. You're not, you don't have the right context. And there's this hope that this experience of difficult beauty, that if people are just patient, they'll see the real me or whatever. And that, while those two ideas to me are incredibly useful tools, they could also be used as a way of, again, the self-protective thing. So a lot of the book for me is about looking at the ways in which I'd also undervalued easy moments of beauty and seen them as less important or less meaningful. And that includes like the experience of being with my own child, or being happy. There was something, or being loved quickly without much struggle. There was something in me that was like deeply skeptical of those things, because they didn't fit into, or they started rather to dismantle this protective scaffolding of theory and things that I could build up in my little palace of self-regard that kept me safe, but perpetually alone and apart. So philosophy in this book really, I really try to turn it around and look at it from as many angles as possible, including the angles in which I'm misusing it or willfully misinterpreting it in order to remain in a protected and withdrawn place. And hopefully by the end of the book, as you said, the last scene of the book is me just listening with awe to the sounds of my husband in the kitchen making coffee, and just being able to think with the same reverence about that example of easy beauty. And that's not something that I can do at the beginning of the book.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just because I know we have 10 minutes left, I'm curious if anybody has any questions.
Nobody ever wants to ask the first one.
Oh, is that an arm that we see up? Okay. Okay, great. And the mics will be wiped down in case anyone's concerned about that.
Thank you so much. You both seem to me to be perhaps reluctant disability advocates. Do you see yourself as disability advocates? And what responsibility, now that you have written a book, do you feel for telling a story beyond your own story, something more universal? Do you feel that's another thing that's been projected upon you as writers?
I'll just say really quickly, I don't see myself as a reluctant disability activist. I see myself in the midst of becoming a better one. I think that I wanted to write a book that was about the difficulty of doing exactly that, and also one that didn't pretend to know what that actually even meant to be a disability advocate. Like, what does that actually mean? And I didn't have a lot of examples to look. A lot of times you read identity books or memoirs, and some of them are written as if from a mountain of complete integration of self, and that's great for them, but I don't know what that is, and I'm not there yet. So I don't think it's about, to me, it's about the purposeful struggle to become not only a better member of my community, but also to become a more familiar and intimately connected to my body, which happens to be disabled. Does that make sense? Like, I just think it's really important for I think there's so much judgment sometimes around people who aren't like the right kinds of advocates. And I just always want to emphasize, like, this is a process. This is like, as things constantly shift, the idea of being a good advocate should shift. And so I think of these as living concepts that I'm in a dialogue with, and a necessarily, intentionally and productively uneasy relationship with, because I don't want to get complacent, and I never want to speak as if I've like got that disability thing all figured out, like.
Yeah, no, I recognize that. I'm not particularly conflicted about being an advocate, which I am in Norway. But I am conflicted about what it means to be a publicly visible disabled person and being understood as a success story, because that's where a lot of the trouble sneaks in, the pressure towards productivity and getting both of those PhDs. It doesn't really relent for other disabled people when prominent disabled people are there to show you how it can be done. So I've tried to think closely about the obligations of being an advocate who has a tenured position in the university, and to not become a bad example just in that way. Yeah. So I spend a lot of my time and with my professor hat on, talking about why things worked out for me, and why that was a result of my family background, my class background, and a number of other factors. I had resources that a lot of people don't have, and to talk about really the structural aspects of disability, rather than just being reduced to an inspirational story, which is a great danger.
Yes, we have a question over here.
That's so well said.
Hi. Do you see any generational differences in terms of identity and orientation when you speak to people in the community younger than you, people growing up today, or versus one generation older than you, etc.? And has there been any shift or changes in identity that way?
It's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, Norway is the country I know, and I would say a definite yes. I mean, people who are, well, roughly half my age seem to be much more ready to embrace their identity as disabled people. This may have been, this may come in waves, but I certainly see the younger generation as much more ready to acknowledge disability as an identity. In Scandinavia, that may be part of the influence from the US and from the UK in part. That we're talking about identity in a very different way in Scandinavia from what we used to be doing. But it also appears to me as a generational sea change. So yeah.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I still think disability has a long way to go. I think we're still, especially in the United States, lagging. But I actually think that Instagram is kind of an incredible tool. Disability, if you look at the history of disability, it's either disabled bodies on display as freaks or sideshows or medical curiosities, or disabled bodies being immediately institutionalized and hidden. And I grew up without really seeing disability anywhere publicly, but now I follow tons and tons of disability, just disabled people on Instagram or TikTok, and they're really, really popular disabled skateboarder influencers, and I think actually just seeing that is incredible, and I wish I was a little younger and braver and could do that. My Instagram is just my book and me crying or something. I don't know, not really, but I don't know how to put I'm struggling with this question of what it means to put my body in a public space. So I have not embraced that myself in a way that maybe I need to have more time to reflect on and think on what value that may hold. But with all the things that social media does that are awful, I think that's one thing that's kind of revolutionary to me and so thrilling. And I know my son will see that, and see these just visual representations of disabilities. So in that way, I think that's a step forward. I think it's always wrong to think about progress as one strand that moves forward and back. And I think the better way of thinking about it is always as two strands, one that's moving forward and one that's moving back. So I think it's always that. There are ways in which there is all this incredible progress with disability, and there are all these ways in which there isn't and is actually a lot of regression. So those things are in a dialogue and tension always.
All right, I think that is almost all the time we have left. Oh, we have 2 minutes left, so
Yeah,
we can take one more question.
So, I'm sorry, I came in a little later, and I'm taking it that you both write nonfiction. So if you were to write fiction, would your character be a character with your disability, or would you write a character, a different type of character? I guess my question is, what fictional characters would you be writing?
I would write any character that felt relevant to the story I wanted to tell. I have absolutely no intention of exclusively writing from one person's experience, no.
Yeah, no, I've done both. I've published one novel in Norway, and I'm in the final stages of another one. First one was not about disability at all, really. The second one is. It depends on the needs of the story, but also just a sense of what aspects of the world I'm trying to write about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think your
Well, sure. I mean, and any kind of embodied experience gives you insight into experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So just a couple things. One, I really do want to thank you both for writing these incredible books. I have to be honest. I know when I read these, I really was deeply, deeply affected by both of these books in very different ways, and I so thank you for that. I thank you for this experience of being able to read your work, and I really hope that everyone in here buys these books because they're that incredible. They need to be read and shared, and they are available for pre-purchase or purchase. And we have a limited supply, people, because they're that amazing. So I hope you go out and do that. And thank you again for being here and for sharing your work and for showing up. And thank all of you. Thank you to everyone for being here as well. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank
You
you.
were so good. Thank you. You were perfect.